Independent National Electoral Commission has cautioned political parties and candidates against premature campaign activities ahead of the 2027 general elections, saying such actions could be breaching the Electoral Act. INEC's Chief Press Secretary, Rotimi Oyekami, said the commission has yet to release the official timetable or the schedule for the polls. He pointed out to the rising numbers of political posters, indirect endorsements, and inflammatory statements as signs of early electioneering. He explained that under the Section 94 of the Electoral Act of 2022, public campaigns can only begin 150 days before the polling day and must end 24 hours before voting, adding that Section 95 also mandates that campaigns must follow INEC's guidelines. Oyekami said no party primaries have been held, nor have any candidates been officially nominated. He added that INEC had already reminded political parties of the rules during its recent quarterly consultative meeting and expects full compliance. Well, joining us now for a chat on INEC's objection to early campaigning and what constitutes early campaigning, amongst others, is Executive Director of Yaga Africa, Sam Itodo. Great to have you on the program with us, Sam. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So just for clarification's sake, what do you believe is the definition of early campaigning? Is it sufficiently clear and comprehensive as it's written within the law, or is it open to interpretation? And how could this ambiguity affect the enforcement of it all?
Well, the Electoral Act is very clear under Section 94 of the Act. It's clear with respect to the commencement of campaigns. And it says campaigns shall not start not earlier than 150 days and not later than 24 hours before the day of an election. And so the timelines for campaigns have been clear. The INEC's guidelines is also clear under Article 33, Sub 4, about, the campaigns. What does campaign mean? Campaign basically is using any tool of communication, whether digital or traditional, to project, a candidacy or promote the programs of a particular political party in such a way that it mobilizes citizens to subscribe to the candidacy and the political preferences of those particular parties. So it is very, very clear what the law says. Now, of course, there is a gap. And the gap actually lies regarding whether third parties can commence campaigns, and if they do so, whether they run foul of the law. Our argument, and civil society groups who actually issued this communication to INEC exactly 2 months ago, was that INEC has the power to regulate campaigns by virtue of the provisions under paragraph 14 of the Constitution. INEC's guidelines are also clear as to what are the conditions that need to be met before campaigns. In fact, the guidelines is clear that any political party and any individual or organization acting on behalf of a political party, if you engage in premature campaign, it is a violation of provisions of the Electoral Act. So, to a large extent, there isn't any ambiguity as to the definition of campaigns as well as the timelines of campaigns. All you just see, it's just politicians, refusing, to comply with the Electoral Act and engaging in all forms of premature campaign in clear violations of provisions of the Electoral Act and INEC's guidelines.
Thank you so much for that. Why do you think this is essential? What issues would you say the law is trying to avoid or prevent by clearly stating that, early campaigns should not happen, or rather campaigns should only happen should only begin from a certain period of time? And from what we've seen so far, defections, shows of solidarity, even from opposition parties, would you say that there's clearly been violation of this law already?
Absolutely. I think there have been clear violations of the law. And there's a reason why a time frame is pegged for commencement of campaigns. We're just 2 years post the 2023 elections. And if you look at whether you are based in the FCT or you're based in other states, you see how billboards have been erected as though we are already in the 2027 campaign season. The laws are very clear. Before commencement of campaign, 4 things must happen. The first, INEC must issue a notice of election. INEC has not issued a notice of election for the 2027 elections. The second is that party primaries must be conducted. There hasn't been any conduct of a party primaries for the 2027 elections. The third condition is that candidates would have emerged. Candidates, not aspirants, is what the law says. And then fourthly, that you have 150 days to the day of an election for campaigns to commence. Those are the 4 conditions. But what we have seen are just clear violations, of these provisions, of our laws. And it's just really unfortunate that we're seeing this. And the reason why that law is introduced is to address 3 things. The first one is that when you commence campaigns early, the potential of deviating from governance and focus on electioneering becomes very high. If you look across the polity today, it appears that the 2027 elections is next week Saturday. And so governance, have been abandoned, and politicians are just interested, in the next election and not focused on addressing the fundamental problems of the welfare and the security of the Nigerian people, which is the primary purpose of governance. The second, it's about the political culture, that we have within our polity. That when you commence campaigns early, you put a lot of pressure on the political system. The Electoral Commission and other democratic institutions will be under pressure because when they are meant to focus attention on dealing with other electoral issues within the electoral cycle, they are busy trying to ensure that they regulate the political space. So there's a lot of pressure, on our democratic institutions. And then thirdly, it's also to the citizens, because when you look across board, whether it's the APC, the ADC, Labour Party, virtually the major political parties, are guilty of violating provisions of the law regarding the commencement of campaigns. And there is a clear distinction between what? Personal political expression and premature campaign. What we have seen is just campaigns masquerading and masked as what? As political consultations, when in actual fact, people are already declaring, for 2027 elections when we're not there yet. And this does not bode well, for our democracy. Good a thing that INEC spokesperson have spoken, but one of the things that we would have loved to see is a clear statement written, from INEC, signed by the National Commissioner, to send a strong message. Yes, the Commission has spoken to political parties in their quarterly meetings, but beyond the spokesperson to the chairman, there is a great need for strong policy statements to come from INEC, but also the security agencies, because it lies and it behoves on the security agencies to go and pull down those billboards that have been erected in different parts of the FCT, across the state is the same thing by different political parties. It's not INEC's responsibility to pull down those billboards. It's the security agencies, especially when there's prima facie evidence that they are in clear violations of the provisions of our laws. But also the National Assembly needs to look at where gaps exist within the current legal framework, especially when you have third parties or groups, or whether you call them movements or whatever they are, that are clearly violating, the laws and are engaged in premature campaign, because it is antithetical, to the whole notion of democratic practice.
Well said, Sam. What I find ironic is the fact that, as Nigerians, we do things lastminute.com. We know very much that is a culture here, but for some reason, with the elections, we are 2 years plus ahead of time. And just like you said, it feels like it's going to happen next week, Saturday. But now that we know that all the electioneering is happening, it's underneath our noses, no one can deny that exists. What are some of the penalties that are prescribed by the Electoral Act for any individuals or political parties that are engaging or found guilty of early campaigning? Is it fines, imprisonment, or sanctions? And do you feel as if any of what I just said, any of those penalties, are enough of a deterrent to the individuals who engage in such?
Quite frankly, the sanctions regime for this kinds of misdemeanor is very weak. And I think that this is where the National Assembly has got an opportunity, to tighten those sanctions. Because the law is clear under Section 97 that if you engage, in premature campaigns, you do what? You commit an offense. But what's the sanction that is prescribed? I think that fines, yes, may be punitive, but they aren't punitive enough. We have to get to a point where if third parties are engaged in premature campaigns, I think they need to be prosecuted for electoral offenses because it is an offense. And yes, there should be, a punishment for either imprisonment or perhaps also disqualification. Because if you cannot respect the basic laws, it doesn't project you as a political party that has respect for the rule of law. And if you don't have respect for the rule of law, then you are not entitled to the votes that people express and their choices they express on election day. And I think that part of the punitive measures that should be introduced, if you engage in premature campaigns, then you should be disqualified for not fielding candidates because you cannot be trusted to respect the rule of law if you eventually record electoral victory at that particular election. So disqualification, I think to a large extent, might serve as a strong punitive measure. But more importantly, is to encourage the political class that there cannot be democracy without political parties that respect the rule of law. The whole notion of democracy is that there are rules and you are bound by those rules because your failure to comply with those rules undermines your political legitimacy. And so if the rules are implemented, it benefits all. And this is a kind of communication, that we need to continue to put on the face of our political class to, for once, just respect the rule of law. Only then can we say we are making progress with our democracy.
I love that you spoke extensively on respecting the rule of law, because in as much as I hear you when you talk about just almost an appeal for the respect for democracy, what is the reality here as to this happening? What is the reality of us seeing a disqualification of a ruling party for flouting some of these rules? Furthermore, what precedent has INEC equally set to ensure that things like this do not happen, whether it's the APC in power or it's the PDP in power? Has there ever been a time where there was proper stringent measures taken as a result of flouting INEC's rules? And based off of that, what is the future of this particular issue? Another conversation or some hard-hitting action?
I think that first we must recognize the limitations that INEC has. Yes, there's a weak sanctions regime, and who would enforce those sanctions? So INEC has got its own limitation. And I've said repeatedly that the National Assembly has got an opportunity. First, they must recognize that when you look across our cities, now, when timetable for elections have not been released by INEC, you already have parties going to the market, making all sorts of, definitive statements about the next elections, and they've gone ahead as though they are the Electoral Commission. That's tactically usurping the powers of the Electoral Commission, and you're undermining INEC. And so laws need to be in place that prevent that. And so where there are weak sort of mechanisms within our legal framework that have been exploited, we need to address that using the reform process. The second point is that INEC performs two functions. First, it is an election management body, but secondly, it is a regulatory institution because paragraph 14, part F of the 1999 Constitution as amended gives INEC the power to regulate political campaigns and political parties. And I think INEC in its regulations tries and makes an attempt to make legal prescriptions. But it needs to also internally review that guidelines. Because one of the things that the parties are exploiting is you have all these phony organizations, third parties, exploiting provisions of the law to launch different forms of campaigns, that even though you look at the text of those campaigns, even if they don't clearly say vote for this person, but you see, there are inferences that can be drawn. It is clear that this is what? This is clear campaigns. And our laws and our judges and our courts also needs to rise to the occasion. And I say that it is important that we test some of these laws and call on the judiciary, to interpret some of the laws that we have. I admit that there are weak sanctions. They need to be fixed through legislative engineering, but INEC can activate its own regulatory powers to introduce, some sanctions. But the state, the law enforcement agencies, need to also act because they are also aware that INEC has not issued the timetable for elections. No primaries have held. But if you look across, for instance, in the FCT, if you look across other states, there are billboards, of campaign billboards across the federal capital. Why are the security agencies not pulling down those billboards, mindful of the fact that they are part of the Interagency Committee on Election Security and the timetable for the 2027 elections have not been released? Even the president issued a statement 2 months ago denouncing that those campaigns are not sanctioned by the presidency. What I expect is that the security agencies will prevail on those organizations, those individuals who are violating, provisions of our law and INEC guidelines and have launched all sorts of campaigns because the presidency have also disowned those. So why is it that those campaigns and billboards are still up there? If you look at the PDP, you look at the ADC and the Labour Party, we've also seen them make definitive statements that are clear campaigns. Why is it that no one is calling on those individuals to retrace their steps and respect the law? None of these parties can feign ignorance because the law and the letters are very clear and INEC guidelines is unambiguous when it comes to issues of this nature.
Very well said. And what reforms, in your opinion, or new strategies could we implement in order to ensure or prevent some of these activities, these early electioneering activities that we've been seeing, especially with the parties who violate the law as prescribed?
No, as I've mentioned, I've talked about legal reforms. I've talked about what INEC can do within the current limits of its powers. But I think the most important reform that is required is the character or perhaps attitudinal reforms on the part of the political class. I think that we cannot keep quiet without calling on our political class to respect, our laws. Our political class should elevate the debate and the discourse on democracy. It is just sad that less than 2 years to the next elections, there are political actors that who are still in power and have not delivered on certain campaign promises. And their focus should be on how to deliver on those promises because INEC has not issued a timetable. So focus should be on governance. Nigerians are facing all forms of economic hardship. There are issues related to security. There are issues related to infrastructure. There are issues related to, political rights and freedom. These are the kinds of things that the state and those who have power should focus on and not be bothered and interested in what happens at the next elections. And it's often said, statesmen focus on dealing with the problems of today, but politicians focus on the next elections. And I just hope that our political class will review their stance on some of these issues and just roll back on this attitude of just placing so much emphasis and interest on elections, as though democracy is about elections and democracy isn't about governance. Deliver first, focus on delivering on the promise of democracy to the people, and leave elections until INEC has issued the timetable and notice of elections.
Well, Executive Director, Yaga Africa, Sam Itodo, thank you so much for joining us today on Newsday.